The untold story of the 1908 Tunguska explosion. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, the people of a remote Siberian forest woke up to something they could never explain. The sun had barely risen over the endless wilderness of the Tunguska region. The land was quiet, as it had been for thousands of years. Pine forests stretched for miles. Rivers cut through the wilderness like silver ribbons. Small indigenous villages dotted the landscape, where hunters and reindeer herders lived simple lives far away from the modern world. But that morning, the sky itself was about to change history. A hunter named Semyon Semenov was sitting on the porch of a small trading post near the Podkamenaya Tunguska River. The air was cool, and the forest smelled of wet earth and pine needles. Suddenly, he noticed something strange. A glowing blue light appeared in the sky. At first, he thought it was the sun reflecting off clouds, but within seconds, the light grew brighter, far brighter than anything he had ever seen. The sky began to burn. A massive fireball streaked across the heavens, leaving a trail of blazing white light behind it. It moved faster than any bird, faster than any plane, though planes were still rare in those days. People across hundreds of miles saw it. Farmers in villages stopped their work and stared upward in disbelief. Hunters deep in the forest froze in place. Even people in distant cities like Irkutsk and Krasnoyarsk noticed a strange glow moving across the sky. The fireball grew brighter and brighter until it looked like a second sun. Then the world exploded. A blinding flash filled the sky, followed by a shock wave so powerful it knocked people off their feet. Windows shattered hundreds of miles away. Buildings shook. Horses panicked. The ground trembled as if the earth itself had been struck by a giant hammer. Semenov later described the moment in terrifying detail. He said the sky split in two, and the entire northern sky was covered with fire. The heat was so intense that he thought his shirt had caught fire. He was thrown from his chair and slammed against the ground. Moments later came the sound. It was not a normal explosion. It was a rolling thunder that seemed to go on forever. Boom, boom, boom. Each blast echoed across the forest like artillery fire from a giant invisible war. Trees snapped like matchsticks. Animals ran in every direction. Reindeer herders miles away were thrown off their feet as the shock wave blasted through the forest. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sky went silent, but the forest was no longer the same. Over 80 million trees had been flattened in a circular pattern across more than 800 square miles. Imagine a forest the size of a major American city, completely knocked down in seconds. Trees lay on the ground, pointing away from a central blast zone, as if a giant invisible hand had pushed them outward. Strangely, in the very center of the explosion, some trees were still standing, but they were stripped bare. No branches, no leaves, just charred trunks sticking into the sky like burned telephone poles. The destruction looked exactly like what scientists would later recognize as the effect of a nuclear airburst. Except this happened in 1908, decades before nuclear weapons existed. The strangest part? There was no crater. Whatever had exploded in the sky had never touched the ground, and the world had no idea what it was. For days afterward, something even stranger began happening across Europe. The night sky started glowing. People in London, Paris, and Berlin reported that the sky remained bright long after sunset. Newspapers wrote about mysterious glowing clouds drifting across the horizon. In Scotland, people claimed they could read a newspaper outside at midnight without using a lamp. Scientists were baffled. Dust particles in the upper atmosphere had spread around the planet, reflecting sunlight in strange ways. But no one yet understood where those particles had come from. Meanwhile, deep in Siberia, the forest still smoldered. Smoke drifted through the shattered trees. Animals avoided the area, and the indigenous Evenki people began telling stories about what they believed had happened. They said the sky god Ogdi had become angry. According to their legends, Ogdi sent fire down from the heavens to punish the earth. For years, many Evenki refused to go near the blast site. They believed the land had been cursed. In fact, the outside world barely paid attention at all. Remember, this was 1908. Russia was still part of the vast Russian Empire under Tsar Nicholas II. Communication across Siberia was slow. The region was incredibly remote, and soon the world became distracted by something even bigger, World War I. The explosion in Tunguska faded into obscurity, becoming little more than a strange rumor from a distant forest. Nearly 20 years passed before anyone seriously investigated it. The man who would finally uncover the mystery was a Russian scientist named Leonid Kulik. Kulik was obsessed with meteorites. He believed that rocks from space held important clues about the origins of the universe. When he first read scattered reports about a massive explosion in Siberia, he immediately suspected something extraordinary. But there was a problem. The Tunguska region was one of the most remote places on Earth. There were no roads, no railways, no maps detailed enough to guide an expedition. Still, Kulik refused to give up. In 1927, almost 20 years after the explosion, he finally organized an expedition into the Siberian wilderness. The journey was brutal. First came the long train ride across Russia, then weeks of travel by boat along frozen rivers. After that, horses and sleds. Finally, they had to walk. For days, they marched through swampy forests filled with mosquitoes and thick underbrush. The ground was often flooded. Food was scarce. Weather conditions were unpredictable. But when Kulik and his team finally reached the blast zone, they were stunned. The forest looked like a giant had smashed it with a hammer. Trees were flattened in every direction. Yet in the very center of the area, something bizarre appeared. A forest of standing poles. Thousands of trees stood upright, but completely burned and stripped of branches. Kulik realized immediately what this meant. The explosion had occurred in the air. A massive object from space had entered Earth's atmosphere and detonated before hitting the ground. This explained why there was no crater, but it raised an even bigger question. What kind of object could explode with such incredible force? Later calculations would estimate the blast energy at between 10 and 15 megatons of TNT. To put that in perspective, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945 was about 15 kilotons. The Tunguska explosion was roughly 1,000 times more powerful, and yet it happened in complete isolation. If it had exploded over a city like London or New York, millions of people could have died. The world had come terrifyingly close to disaster and never even realized it. Kulik searched desperately for fragments of the meteorite, but he never found any. No large pieces, no crater, nothing. This only deepened the mystery. Some scientists proposed wild theories. Maybe it had been a giant comet made of ice. Maybe a natural gas explosion underground. Others even suggested something more bizarre, an alien spacecraft. The mystery became one of the greatest unsolved puzzles in scientific history. But modern science has finally brought us closer to the truth. Most researchers now believe the Tunguska event was caused by a stony asteroid about 50 to 60 meters wide. As it entered Earth's atmosphere at more than 60,000 kilometers per hour, the pressure and heat became enormous. The asteroid compressed the air in front of it, creating temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. Eventually, the rock simply could not survive the stress. At about 5 to 10 kilometers above the forest, it exploded. The energy released was equal to a massive thermonuclear blast. A giant fireball formed in the sky. The shock wave blasted outward at supersonic speed, and the forests of Tunguska were flattened in seconds. Even today, more than a century later, the scars remain visible from space. The trees eventually grew back, but the pattern of destruction is still preserved in satellite images. It looks like a giant butterfly shape across the Siberian wilderness, a permanent reminder of the day the sky exploded. And perhaps the most chilling part of the story is this. Events like Tunguska are not rare in cosmic terms. Asteroids of that size strike Earth every few hundred years. Most explode over oceans or remote regions where nobody notices. But someday, one might not. Today, scientists around the world track thousands of near-Earth asteroids using powerful telescopes and radar systems. Organizations like NASA's Planetary Defense Coordination Office monitor potential threats from space. The goal is simple. Make sure the next Tunguska doesn't catch humanity by surprise. Because on that summer morning in 1908, the Earth was lucky, very lucky. The sky turned to fire, the forest was destroyed, but humanity survived, mostly because no one lived where the explosion happened. History could have been very different, and somewhere out in the dark depths of space, millions of other rocks still wander silently through the solar system, waiting. For nearly 2 decades after the great explosion of 1908, the Tunguska region remained one of the strangest and least understood places on Earth. The forests slowly began to grow back. Animals cautiously returned, but the stories never stopped. Local Evenki hunters continued to speak about the terrible morning when the sky exploded. They described a burning object racing across the sky like a flaming spear thrown by the gods. Some said the ground shook so violently that trees seemed to dance. Others claimed the heat of the blast scorched their skin even from miles away. One man swore that he saw the sky split open and release a pillar of fire. Yet despite these chilling accounts, almost no scientists came to investigate. The Russian Empire had collapsed. The country had been torn apart by revolution, civil war, and economic chaos. In the middle of all that turmoil, a mysterious explosion in a distant Siberian forest seemed like a minor curiosity. But Leonid Kulik never forgot about it. Kulik was not an ordinary scientist. He had the stubborn determination of an explorer and the curiosity of a detective. He believed that meteorites were extremely valuable scientific treasures. Each one carried pieces of the early solar system, clues about how planets were formed billions of years ago. And if the reports from Tunguska were true, then somewhere in that shattered forest might lie the largest meteorite ever found. So he made it his mission to find it. Convincing the Soviet government to fund the expedition was not easy. Russia in the 1920s was struggling to rebuild after years of war. Resources were scarce. Money for scientific expeditions was limited. But Kulik argued passionately. If a giant meteorite had fallen in Siberia, It could contain rare metals or minerals valuable to both science and industry. Eventually, his persistence paid off. In 1927, nearly 20 years after the explosion, Kulik finally received permission and funding to travel to Tunguska. The journey itself became an adventure worthy of a novel. First, the expedition boarded a train that rattled across thousands of miles of Russian countryside. The railway stretched across endless plains, frozen rivers, and distant mountains. Days passed, then weeks. Finally, they reached the edge of the Siberian wilderness. But the real journey was only beginning. There were no roads leading into the Tunguska region. From that point forward, the expedition had to rely on boats, horses, and sheer determination. They traveled by sled across icy rivers. They marched through dense forests where sunlight barely reached the ground. Mosquitoes swarmed in massive clouds. Swamps swallowed their boots. Food supplies ran low. At times, the expedition nearly turned back, but Kulik refused. He was convinced they were getting closer to one of the greatest scientific discoveries in history. Eventually, the team reached an Evenki settlement. The villagers welcomed them cautiously. The Evenki people had lived in this region for generations, and they knew the forest better than anyone. When Kulik asked them about the explosion, the villagers grew uneasy. Some refused to speak about it at all. Others said the area was cursed. According to their stories, the explosion had been caused by a powerful sky spirit who punished the earth with fire. They warned Kulik not to go there. They believed evil forces still lingered in the forest. But Kulik, being a scientist, did not believe in curses. To him, the Tunguska explosion was simply a natural event waiting to be understood. Eventually, he convinced a few reluctant hunters to guide his expedition deeper into the wilderness. For days, they traveled along muddy trails and winding rivers. The forest seemed endless. Then, one morning, something strange appeared on the horizon. At first, it looked like a vast area of dead trees. As they moved closer, the view became clearer. The forest had been destroyed. Thousands upon thousands of trees lay scattered across the ground like fallen dominoes. Kulik stopped in his tracks. The sight was unbelievable. Entire hillsides had been flattened. Trees that once stood more than 30 meters tall now lay snapped and broken, their trunks pointing outward from a distant central point. It looked as if a gigantic explosion had erupted in the middle of the forest and blasted everything away. The team continued walking deeper into the destruction. Everywhere they looked, the same strange pattern appeared. Trees were lying flat on the ground in long radial lines. The closer they moved toward the center of the blast zone, the stranger things became. Suddenly, the fallen trees disappeared. Instead, they found something even more bizarre. a forest of standing trunks. Thousands of trees were still upright, but they were completely stripped of their branches. No leaves, no limbs, just tall, blackened poles rising into the sky. The scene looked almost supernatural. Kulik immediately understood what he was seeing. This was the exact pattern created by a massive air explosion. The blast wave had spread outward horizontally, knocking down trees across hundreds of miles. But directly beneath the explosion, the shock wave had moved downward with such force that it stripped branches from the trees without knocking them over. It was the same effect scientists would later observe during nuclear tests decades later, except this had happened long before nuclear weapons existed. Kulik was standing inside the footprint of one of the most powerful natural explosions in recorded history. But something was still missing: the crater. If a meteorite large enough to destroy an entire forest had struck the ground, it should have created a gigantic crater. Yet there was nothing. No hole, no massive chunk of rock, no obvious fragments. Kulik searched everywhere. He examined marshes and small lakes, believing one of them might hide the meteorite. In one swampy area, he discovered a strange circular depression. Excited, he ordered his team to begin draining the water so they could search the bottom. For weeks they worked in freezing mud, digging and pumping water away. But when they finally reached the bottom of the depression, there was nothing there. No meteorite, no impact crater, just ordinary soil. The mystery deepened. If the meteorite had exploded in the air, where were the pieces? Normally, meteorites survive atmospheric entry and leave fragments scattered across the ground. But in Tunguska, the object seemed to have completely vanished. Kulik refused to give up. Over the next decade, he organized several more expeditions to the region. Each time, he carefully mapped the pattern of fallen trees. He measured the direction of the blast. He interviewed local witnesses who had seen the fireball. One elderly Evenki hunter told him a terrifying story. The man said that when the explosion happened, the ground shook so violently that he thought the world was ending. He said the sky turned bright like the sun, and a hot wind knocked him off his feet. Then he saw the forest catch fire in the distance. Other witnesses described hearing thunder-like explosions that continued for several minutes. Some reported seeing a column of smoke rising into the sky for hours afterward. All these accounts helped Kulik reconstruct the event. Something enormous had entered Earth's atmosphere. It had traveled at incredible speed, and it had exploded high above the forest with unimaginable power. But still, the object itself remained missing. As the years passed, scientists around the world began to take interest in the Tunguska mystery. Newspapers in Europe and America published articles about the strange Siberian explosion. Speculation ran wild. Some scientists believed the object was a giant comet made mostly of ice. If that were true, it could have vaporized completely in the atmosphere, leaving no fragments behind. Others suggested a rare type of stony asteroid that shattered into microscopic pieces during the explosion. But not everyone accepted these explanations. In the mid-20th century, a more bizarre theory began to spread.
A few researchers proposed that the Tunguska explosion might have been caused by an alien spacecraft. They argued that the object's mid-air explosion and lack of debris seemed unnatural. Science fiction writers quickly embraced the idea. Stories about crashed alien ships hidden deep in Siberian forests captured the imagination of readers around the world. But serious scientists remained skeptical. Extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and there was none. Still, one fact remained undeniable. The Tunguska event had been incredibly powerful. Modern calculations estimate the explosion released energy equivalent to about 10 to 15 megatons of TNT. That is roughly equal to the power of the largest thermonuclear bombs ever tested. And yet, it occurred naturally, without warning, without any defense. If the same explosion had happened above a major city, the destruction would have been catastrophic. Entire metropolitan areas could have been wiped out instantly. The Tunguska forest had been destroyed, but humanity had escaped disaster purely by chance, because in 1908 almost no one lived there. The Earth had been lucky, but scientists began to wonder something far more frightening. What if the next one didn't explode over an empty forest? What if it exploded over New York, or London, or Los Angeles? That terrifying question would eventually lead scientists to start watching the skies more carefully than ever before. Because the story of Tunguska was not just about the past, it was a warning about the future. Somewhere in space, millions of asteroids continue to drift silently through the solar system. Most will never come near Earth, but a few might, and history has already shown what happens when one of them does. When the world realized the danger from space. By the middle of the 20th century, the mystery of Tunguska had begun to attract worldwide attention. Scientists from different countries studied the reports, the maps, and the photographs taken during the early expeditions. But something unexpected happened that changed how researchers viewed the Tunguska explosion forever. Humanity invented nuclear weapons. In 1945, during the final days of World War II, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The explosions shocked the world. Entire cities were destroyed in seconds. Buildings were flattened. Forests burned. Shock waves shattered windows miles away. When scientists later studied photographs of those explosions, they noticed something eerie. The destruction patterns looked strangely similar to what Leonid Kulik had documented in the Tunguska forest decades earlier. Trees flattened outward from a central blast, standing trunks directly beneath the explosion, a massive circular pattern of destruction. For the first time, scientists realized something terrifying. The Tunguska explosion had behaved almost exactly like a nuclear detonation.
Except it had happened naturally. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union conducted dozens of nuclear tests in remote deserts and oceans. These tests provided valuable data about how large explosions affect the environment. Shock waves, thermal radiation, blast patterns. As scientists compared those results with Kulik's maps from Tunguska, the similarities became undeniable. The Siberian explosion had been an airburst. The object from space had exploded before reaching the ground, and the power of that explosion was enormous. Researchers estimated that the blast released between 10 and 15 megatons of energy. To understand that scale, imagine this. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima had an explosive power of about 15 kilotons. The Tunguska explosion was roughly 1,000 times stronger. If such an explosion occurred over a major modern city, the destruction would be unimaginable. Entire neighborhoods would vanish. Skyscrapers would collapse. Millions of people could be affected. And yet, the most frightening part was this. The Tunguska object had been relatively small. Modern calculations suggest the asteroid was only about 50 to 60 meters wide. That is roughly the length of a football field. Compared to the massive asteroids that wiped out the dinosaurs 66 million years ago, the Tunguska object was tiny. Yet it still flattened more than 80 million trees across an area of over 800 square miles. That realization forced scientists to rethink an important question. How often do objects like that hit Earth? For centuries, people believed that asteroid impacts were extremely rare events. But new research suggested otherwise. Small asteroids enter Earth's atmosphere far more frequently than anyone had previously imagined. Most burn up harmlessly in the upper atmosphere. Some explode in the air. Others fall into the oceans where no one sees them. Because much of Earth's surface is covered by water or empty wilderness, these events often go unnoticed. But the Tunguska explosion proved that when one happens over land, the results can be dramatic. During the 1960s and 1970s, scientists began searching for other evidence of similar events. They examined satellite data. They studied historical records. They analyzed unusual explosions reported in remote areas. Gradually, a pattern began to emerge. Large atmospheric explosions were not unique. They had happened before, and they would happen again.
One of the most important discoveries came from American military satellites. During the Cold War, the United States launched satellites designed to detect nuclear explosions anywhere on Earth. These satellites were extremely sensitive. They could detect the flash of a nuclear detonation even on the other side of the planet. But occasionally, the satellites detected mysterious explosions that were clearly not nuclear tests. Bright flashes appeared high in the atmosphere. Shock waves spread across the sky, yet no country had launched a weapon. Scientists soon realized what the satellites were seeing: asteroids. Small space rocks entering Earth's atmosphere at incredible speeds. As they slammed into the atmosphere, intense pressure and heat caused them to explode in massive fireballs. These explosions were essentially miniature versions of the Tunguska event. Some were small, others were surprisingly powerful. One such event occurred in 1963 over the Indian Ocean. Satellites recorded a massive explosion in the atmosphere with an energy equivalent to several kilotons of TNT. Fortunately, it happened far from populated areas. But the data confirmed something important. Earth was being struck by objects from space more often than anyone had believed. This discovery alarmed scientists. If these objects could explode without warning, humanity might one day face a serious threat. For decades, however, little action was taken. Asteroid detection technology was still primitive. Telescopes could only observe a small portion of the sky, and most governments were focused on Cold War politics rather than planetary defense. But the Tunguska mystery continued to inspire researchers. In the 1990s, powerful new telescopes began scanning the sky for near-Earth objects. Astronomers started cataloging asteroids whose orbits crossed Earth's path around the Sun. What they found was both fascinating and unsettling. Thousands of asteroids were already known. Many were harmless, but some had orbits that brought them dangerously close to Earth. These were called near-Earth asteroids, and among them were objects roughly the same size as the Tunguska asteroid. Fortunately, none of the known asteroids posed an immediate threat, but the discovery revealed something important. The solar system was far more crowded than scientists had realized. Millions of asteroids exist between Mars and Jupiter. Occasionally, gravitational forces push some of them into new orbits, and once in a while, one of them crosses Earth's path. Most are tiny, but every so often a larger one appears. The more astronomers searched, the more objects they discovered. And the more they discovered, the more they realized how little they had previously known. Then something happened that reminded the world of Tunguska in a dramatic way. On February 15, 2013, residents of a Russian city called Chelyabinsk experienced something terrifying. Early that morning, a brilliant fireball appeared in the sky. Dash cameras recorded it streaking across the horizon like a blazing comet. The light was brighter than the sun.
Moments later, the object exploded high above the city. A powerful shock wave blasted across Chelyabinsk. Windows shattered across thousands of buildings. Car alarms went off. People were knocked off their feet. More than 1,000 people were injured, mostly by broken glass. The explosion released energy equivalent to about 500 kilotons of TNT. That was more than 30 times stronger than the Hiroshima bomb. And yet the object responsible was only about 20 meters wide. For scientists, the Chelyabinsk explosion was a wake-up call. It proved that Tunguska-style events were not just ancient history. They could happen again, and they could happen anywhere. The only reason the Chelyabinsk event was not far worse was simple luck. The asteroid exploded high in the atmosphere. If it had exploded lower, the destruction would have been much more severe. The event renewed global interest in asteroid detection and planetary defense. Governments began funding new programs to track potentially hazardous asteroids. Astronomers around the world started working together to monitor the skies. One of the leading organizations in this effort is the NASA. Within NASA, a special team was created called the Planetary Defense Coordination Office. Their mission is simple but crucial. Find dangerous asteroids before they find us. Using powerful telescopes and radar systems, scientists now track tens of thousands of near-Earth objects. Most pose no danger, but every newly discovered asteroid helps scientists understand the risks better. Some researchers are even developing plans to deflect asteroids if one ever threatens Earth. One method involves crashing a spacecraft into the asteroid to change its orbit slightly. Another idea involves using gravity to slowly pull the asteroid off course. These ideas may sound like science fiction, but they are already being tested. In 2022, NASA launched a mission called Double Asteroid Redirection Test, often called DART. The spacecraft deliberately crashed into a small asteroid to test whether humans could change the path of a space object. The experiment was successful. For the first time in history, humanity had proven it might be able to defend the planet from a dangerous asteroid. And yet, despite all these advances, the Tunguska event still remains one of the most fascinating natural disasters ever recorded.
Because it reminds us of something both humbling and unsettling. Our planet exists in a cosmic shooting gallery. Every day, Earth travels millions of miles through space. Tiny meteors burn up in the atmosphere constantly. Most are harmless, but occasionally a larger object appears. When that happens, the results can be spectacular or catastrophic. The Siberian forest of Tunguska was the silent witness to one such encounter. A rock from space entered the atmosphere. The sky turned to fire, and in a single moment, the power of the universe revealed itself to the people living below. But the story of Tunguska is not just about destruction.
It is also about discovery. It forced scientists to study the sky more carefully. It inspired the creation of planetary defense systems, and it reminded humanity that even in the modern age, our world is still connected to the vast and unpredictable universe beyond our atmosphere. Somewhere out there, countless asteroids continue to orbit the sun. Most will never come near Earth, but a few will, and thanks to the lessons learned from Tunguska, humanity is now watching the skies more closely than ever before, because the next visitor from space may already be on its way.